When things seem to go wrong with the environment, people often accept that the government should take charge to protect it from people, without asking, is central control any better? There was a time when population was low and conservation wasn't really on people's minds. Like in Nepal. Big mountains, big cats, and diverse forests that the people use for firewood and animal feed. But as population began to rise, deforestation started to become a problem. So in 1957, the government took control of the forests to try to stop people from using them so much. The plan was to put it all under government ownership, take inventories of all the trees, find out how much can be used, and require people to have a permit to take anything from the forests. Then they imprisoned or fined those who broke the rules. Good plan? No. Bad plan. Bad government. You see, even though it wasn't in writing, the locals considered the forests their own property and they managed it themselves. While conservation wasn't a big issue, in some places like the mountainous regions where growth was slow, they had to work together to closely manage how much they took and how often. Other villages might just make sure things were distributed fairly. These institutions most likely weren't adapted for the new demand on the forests. But after nationalization, most of the communes that used to operate were basically split up since they didn't feel they had ownership of the forests anymore. What came after was no longer a matter of trying to work together, but competing against each other. You see, to get firewood or animal feed, they needed to get a permit. But the permit offices were scattered and could take days to get to. So most people just risked the consequences and took products illegally. And Nepal is made up of thousands of forests scattered over difficult terrain. Monitoring of the new rules turned out to be basically impossible. There was fear of enforcement, but most illegal activity went unpunished, so people basically just took as much as they wanted. Most people had some private land that they used for crops and trees. But under the new laws, the government could take private land if they felt it was necessary. For example, any land left unused for longer than 2 years could be taken by the government. But letting the land rest like this was common practice for regeneration. Why should they lose their land for taking proper care of it? So clearly rules like these need to be changed. But to change a rule, they would need to travel to a forest office, convince them that the rule needs to be changed, carry that onto another level of government where a bunch of people in suits can deliberate, and if that's successful, they need to communicate that change to the millions of people in the secluded places all over the country. This is way too much work to change one rule, but really it's indicative of the inefficiency of the whole plan. So in the end, it was all ultimately a failure. After government control, the people didn't work together. They couldn't work together because the forests weren't technically theirs to manage, and deforestation actually accelerated. It wasn't that the government was incompetent or evil. It's just to implement the plan they needed to decide who could use it, when, how much, monitor everything, and make sure all the information on these things was accurate. And each forest and each community would need different considerations. It's expensive. And the people won't think it's fair when some outsider comes in and tries to claim the resource, even with good intentions. And outsiders typically won't understand as much or care as much about a resource compared to those who work with and rely on it. They're just too disconnected from the resource. And the further away you look at someone or something from, the more you'll overlook the way they really are. You might think one group of people are inherently sensible and another are inherently incompetent. You'll be forced to work from theory and assumptions, and models like the tragedy of the commons and the prisoner's dilemma. Models like these are nice because they can explain different situations all over the world, but they're just metaphors that can tell you maybe one or two things. Take this picture that I drew. It represents a person. You can use it to describe a person in different situations, but it doesn't really tell you anything about real people. We would have to accept a lot of assumptions to use it literally, like people are two-dimensional faceless anorexics with no hands or genitals. We have to make a lot of assumptions to make these models work too. And when policymakers assume that these assumptions are true in real situations, they run into problems. So we need a different approach. Let's look here, in Alanya, Turkey. In the 1970s, the fishery wasn't doing great. There were too many fishermen chasing fewer and fewer fish. People invested in boats and fishing equipment, but there were so many people fishing that there was no guarantee they would catch enough fish to make their money back. So people would fight, physically, over the good fishing spots. So the local fishing cooperative developed a system to make it fair. The whole area was split up into fishing spots, such that fishing in one spot wouldn't block the migration of fish to the next spot. Every year, a list is produced of all the licensed fishers and they are randomly assigned to a spot. Then every day from September to January, each fisher moves east to the next location. Then from January to May, when the fish migration switches direction, they switch the direction of the cycle to ensure everybody gets a fair chance. Monitoring people's compliance with the rules came about naturally from the rotation system. Everybody knows where they're supposed to be, and if someone's in your spot, you'll know right away. Monitoring like this is almost free. And they carry out the punishment themselves too. If they need to, they can cut a fisherman's nets or kick them out of the system. But because most people understand the system is beneficial to everyone, they usually just need to give them a warning. And most everyone just follows the rules. And rules are easier to change because those who make the rules are those who follow them. If they meet somewhere in town, everybody gets a chance to bring up issues and everybody hears them. Communication this way is cheap and quick. So the people of Alanya were able to create their own institutions to use the resource in a fair way. It's not that the government shouldn't have any hand in the resource. It's just ultimately, resource management isn't done in a boardroom by legislators, but by foresters and fishermen, those who work with the resource in the field. So the management needs to be receptive to them in some way. That's why these institutions are best adapted case by case. Sweeping statements about who should do what, or how the environment can be helped, are not very helpful. I mean, this strategy that failed in Nepal actually works okay in other places like Canada. But most Canadians don't heat their home with wood or use forest products for fodder. So the permits go out to large companies rather than hundreds of thousands of individuals. Also, the population of Canada is about the same as Nepal. In 1978, the Nepal government started working with the communities, allowing them to own and manage the forests. They began growing back and people's livelihoods improved. The Grand Banks cod was one of the biggest populations on the planet. So what happened? Well, it turned out cod was made of meat. And because of advances in technology, cod catch reached record levels. The researchers and local fishermen warned about the declines in population. So why didn't it stop? The way the system was set up, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans